The wind, a mournful whisper across the high plains, carried the scent of wood smoke and simmering rabbit stew through the ill-fitting cracks of Elias Thorne's cabin. Dust motes danced in the slivers of fading sunlight that pierced the gloom, each a tiny galaxy in the quiet universe of his solitude. He stirred the pot, the ladle clinking softly against iron, a sound as familiar and desolate as the beat of his own heart. It had been 2 years since Martha was laid to rest under the lone pine on the ridge, 2 years where the silence in the cabin had grown heavier than stone, broken only by the crackle of the fire or the sigh of the wind. He was a man carved from the rugged landscape itself, weathered and unyielding, his grief a hidden well, deep and cold. He ladled a portion into a chip bowl, the steam rising like a fleeting prayer. His movements were deliberate, economical, the habits of a man long accustomed to fending for himself. He turned towards his simple table, a single plank on trestles. That's when he heard it, a sound so small it was almost lost to the keening wind. "Mister? Can we taste your stew?" Elias froze. The voice was a mere breath, fragile as a dry leaf. He wasn't a man easily startled, but the solitude had become his skin, and this was a rent in its fabric. He turned slowly, his hand instinctively resting near the worn Colt at his hip, a relic of a past that felt a lifetime away. 3 figures stood huddled in the open doorway, framed by the dying light. Children. Small, shadow-thin, their clothes little more than rags clinging to bony frames. The eldest, a girl with hair the color of parched earth, stood protectively in front of 2 younger ones, a boy whose knuckles were white where he gripped her tattered skirt, and a tiny girl, barely more than a toddler, peering out from behind her legs, a thumb wedged firmly in her mouth. Dust caked their faces, tear tracks etched pale rivers through the grime. They looked like windblown sparrows, fallen from a nest too soon. Elias said nothing, his gaze sweeping over them, noting the hollows in their cheeks, the tremor in the eldest girl's hands. He was a man of few words, fewer still for strangers. His life was his own, its borders clearly marked by loss. The girl spoke again, her voice a little stronger this time, though a quiver remained. "It smells real good, mister. We ain't eaten since a long time." Elias's eyes, the color of a winter sky, were hard. He'd seen hardship, plenty of it. The plains were an unforgiving crucible. But then, his gaze met the eldest girl's. And the world tilted. Her eyes. They were not merely the eyes of a hungry child. They were old, ancient even, reflecting a sorrow so profound, so stark, it resonated with the hollow ache in his own chest where Martha's laughter used to live. In their depths, he saw not just fear and desperation, but a weary resilience, a flicker of something that understood the language of loss, the dialect of despair. It was an echo of the emptiness he carried, a shared glimpse into an abyss he thought was his alone. The hardness in his own gaze wavered, cracks appearing in the stone facade. His breath caught. The Colt felt heavy and useless at his side. The wind outside seemed to hold its breath too. He saw Martha's eyes for a fleeting second, not in their color or shape, but in the sheer weight of unspoken suffering they held. He saw the ghosts of children he and Martha had prayed for but never had. These were not just drifters, they were shards of a broken world, much like himself. The stew grew cold in his bowl, forgotten. His silence stretched, thick and heavy, until the little boy whimpered softly, a tiny, wounded sound. Elias's throat worked. The words wouldn't come, but his action spoke. He turned from the doorway, his broad back to them for a moment, and reached for 3 more bowls from the rough-hewn shelf. The clinking of pottery was the only answer they needed. He didn't ask their names, nor where they came from. Questions felt like stones, too heavy for the fragile peace that had settled, unbidden, in the small cabin. He placed the bowls on the table, each filled with a generous portion of the rabbit stew, rich with carrots and wild potatoes he'd dug himself. The aroma, which moments before had been a comfort only to him, now seemed to expand, warming the chilled air between them. The children approached the table with a caution that spoke volumes of past cruelties. The eldest, Lily he'd later learn her name was, guided the smaller ones, Tom and little Sarah. Sarah, still clutching Lily's skirt, kept her wide, solemn eyes fixed on Elias, as if he might transform into a wolf. He sat on his usual stool, leaving them the bench Martha had favored. He ate slowly, his gaze averted, allowing them the dignity of their hunger without scrutiny. The only sounds were the scrape of spoons against bowls and the soft, almost desperate gulps as they ate. He noticed Lily ensuring her siblings had enough, pushing a piece of rabbit towards Tom's bowl, wiping Sarah's chin with the back of her hand with a tenderness that belied her own youth and hardship. It was a gesture so achingly familiar, so reminiscent of Martha's quiet care, that a pang shot through Elias, sharp and unexpected. He pushed it down, back into the cold well. When they were finished, scrape marks clean on the bottom of their bowls, a kind of torpor settled over them. Their eyelids drooped. The fire in the hearth crackled, a warm counterpoint to the wind that now howled with greater ferocity outside, rattling the single window pane. Elias rose and added another log to the flames, the orange light flickering across their weary faces. Lily's head nodded, then jerked up, her eyes seeking his, a question in them. He understood. Where would they go? The night was black, the plains vast and indifferent. He gestured towards the corner by the hearth, where a thick bearskin lay, a relic from his trapping days. You can sleep there, he said, his voice raspy from disuse, yet softer than he intended. Lily's shoulders sagged with relief. She didn't thank him with words, but her eyes, those knowing, sorrowful eyes, conveyed more than platitudes ever could. He watched as she settled her siblings, tucking the edges of the bearskin around them, her movements economical and practiced. She lay down beside them, a small, fierce guardian. Elias retreated to his own cot on the other side of the cabin. Sleep did not come easily. The familiar silence was now filled with the soft breathing of the children, a rhythm both alien and strangely comforting. He lay staring at the rough-hewn ceiling, the shadows dancing. Martha's presence felt strong tonight, not as a painful void, but as a gentle approval. He thought of her hands, calloused from work but always gentle, mending his clothes, tending her small herb garden. He saw her smile, the way it crinkled the corners of her eyes. He had built walls around his heart so high, so thick, he thought nothing could ever breach them. Yet, 3 small, starved children and a pair of eyes that mirrored his own desolation had found a crack. The wind outside seemed to whisper their untold story, a litany of hardship he wasn't sure he wanted to hear, but knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, he would. For now, they were safe. For now, the cabin held more than just one solitary, aching heart. It held 4. Days bled into one another, marked by the rising and setting of the sun, the rhythm of chores, and the slow, cautious unfurling of trust. Elias learned their names without asking. Lily, her voice still quiet but gaining a thread of steadiness, would murmur them when guiding her siblings. Tom, a boy whose initial fear was slowly being replaced by a watchful curiosity, would sometimes echo her. Sarah remained mostly silent, her eyes large and dark like forest pools, following Elias's every move. She still clung to Lily, but once, when Elias was mending a harness near the fire, she had crept close, her small hand reaching out to tentatively touch the worn leather before darting back. He hadn't acknowledged it, sensing that any direct attention would send her scurrying, but a warmth had spread through his chest, unfamiliar and surprisingly pleasant. He taught them small things, without making it seem like teaching. How to stack firewood so it wouldn't tumble. How to check the snares he set for rabbits, though he always did the grim part himself, away from their sight. Lily, he discovered, had a knack for it, her movements deft, her observations keen. She would watch him, her brow furrowed in concentration, and then replicate his actions with a quiet efficiency. Tom, less patient, was more interested in the shapes the clouds made, or the way the prairie grass rippled like a great, green ocean. Elias found himself speaking more, not much, but enough. He'd point out a hawk circling overhead, name a wildflower pushing through the stubborn soil. He told them, one evening, as the stars began to prick the vast, dark canvas of the sky, about the constellations Martha had taught him. He spoke her name aloud, and the sound of it in the quiet cabin, shared with these small listeners, didn't hurt as much as he'd expected. It felt like releasing a trapped bird. Lily listened, her head tilted, those old eyes fixed on his face. She asked no questions about Martha, but he sensed an understanding pass between them, a silent acknowledgement of loss. He found an old, faded calico dress of Martha's tucked away in a chest. It was too large for Lily, but he carefully cut it down, his large, calloused hand surprisingly gentle with the needle and thread, a skill Martha had insisted he learn. When he presented it to Lily, her eyes widened, and for the first time, a small, hesitant smile touched her lips. It was like seeing the first flower of spring after a long, hard winter. She held the dress to her chest, the worn fabric soft against her cheek. That night, she wore it, and she seemed to stand a little taller, a little less like a frightened sparrow. He'd also found a small, whittled horse, unfinished, that he'd started for a child that never came. He smoothed its rough edges with his knife and gave it to Tom, who clutched it as if it were treasure. For Sarah, he carved a tiny bird from a piece of scrapwood, its wings outstretched. She held it in her small palm, turning it over and over, her lips moving silently. These small acts of creation, of offering, were like water on parched land, for him as much as for them. The cabin still held its memories of Martha, but now, new, tentative sounds were woven into its fabric, the murmur of children's voices, the occasional, soft thud of a wooden toy, the rustle of a mended dress. The silence was still there, but it was no longer empty. It was watchful, waiting. The shadow first appeared as a speck in the distance, a smudge against the vast blue canvas of the prairie sky. Elias, his eyes accustomed to scanning the horizon for game or weather, saw it before the children did. He was splitting logs, the rhythmic thud of the axe a familiar beat to his day. He paused, axe mid-swing, his gaze narrowing. A rider. Coming fast. A knot tightened in his stomach. Strangers were rare in this isolated stretch, and rarely brought good news. He set the axe down, his movements unhurried, but a primal alertness hummed beneath his skin. Lily, who had been helping gather kindling, looked up, sensing the shift in him. Her eyes followed his to the approaching figure. Fear, swift and stark, leached the tentative color from her cheeks. She instinctively reached for Tom and Sarah, pulling them closer to the cabin wall. Elias didn't speak, but his presence was a shield. He watched the rider draw nearer, a tall man on a dark horse, his face obscured by a wide-brimmed hat and the dust kicked up by his mount. There was an arrogance in his posture, a sense of grim purpose that set Elias's teeth on edge. This was not a friendly visit. As the rider reined in a few yards from the cabin, the dust settling around him like a shroud, Elias recognized the cut of his coat, the badge glinting dully on his chest. A lawman, or someone masquerading as one. The man's eyes, cold and assessing, swept over Elias, then lingered on the children huddled by the wall. A sneer touched his thin lips. "Name's Grimshaw," he announced, his voice like gravel. "From the county orphanage. I'm looking for 3 runaways. A girl, Lily, about 12. 2 younger. Matches this lot, wouldn't you say?" Lily flinched as if struck. Tom buried his face in her side. Sarah began to cry, a thin, terrified wail that pierced the stillness. Elias felt a cold fury rise within him, a protective instinct he hadn't known he still possessed. It was the same fury he'd felt when Martha had been ill, helpless against the sickness that stole her. This, however, was a tangible threat, one he could face. He stepped forward slightly, positioning himself between Grimshaw and the children. "They're under my care," Elias said, his voice low and steady, like the rumble of distant thunder. Grimshaw chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. "Your care?" "They're wards of the county, Thorn. Property, you might say. Stole away from a perfectly good institution. Their folks died of the fever, left nothing. Ungrateful whelps," he spat on the ground. "I'm taking them back." The word property struck Elias like a whip. He looked at Lily's face, pale but resolute, her arms wrapped tightly around her siblings. He saw not property, but spirit, courage, and a desperate yearning for safety. He thought of her mended dress, Tom's wooden horse, Sarah's tiny bird. Small anchors in a stormy world. "They ain't property," Elias stated, his voice quiet but carrying the weight of conviction. "They're children." And they ain't going with you. Grimshaw's eyes narrowed. Is that a threat, old man? He shifted in his saddle, his hand moving towards the gun at his hip. Elias didn't flinch. His own hand remained loose at his side, but his stance was rooted, immovable as the ancient stones of the prairie. It's a fact, Elias said. This is my land. They're welcome here. The air crackled with unspoken violence. The wind picked up, swirling dust around them, as if nature itself held its breath. Lily watched, her eyes wide with terror but also a dawning, fragile hope. She had seen fear in adults before, but never this quiet, unyielding strength on her behalf. The confrontation stretched, taut as a bowstring. Grimshaw's gaze flickered from Elias's stony face to the colt at his hip, then back to the children. He was a bully, accustomed to easy victories over the weak and defenseless. Elias was neither. He saw no fear in the old cowboy's eyes, only a grim determination that promised a fight he might not win, or one that would cost him more than he was willing to pay for 3 scrawny orphans. Their trouble, Grimshaw sneered, though some of the bluster had left his voice. Always running. Their uncle tried to take them in, Silas Blackwood, but they ran from him too. Said he was cruel. Likely just didn't want to do a lick of work. The name Silas Blackwood sent a fresh wave of terror through Lily. Her grip on her siblings tightened. Elias noted it. This Grimshaw didn't care about the children's welfare, only about returning them, like stray cattle. He was an instrument of a system that saw them as burdens, not beings. Seems they had good reason to run, Elias said, his voice still level. A child knows cruelty when they feel it. And they know kindness when it's offered. He thought of the hunger in their eyes that first night, not just for food, but for safety, for a moment's peace. Grimshaw scoffed. Kindness won't fill their bellies forever, Thorn. The orphanage provides rules, discipline. That's what they need. Elias looked at the man, at the soulless certainty in his eyes. They need a chance, he said. A chance to heal. Not a cage. He remembered Martha, her belief in the resilience of living things, whether a struggling plant in her garden or a wounded bird. These children were wounded, deeply. But they were not broken. Not yet. The silence returned, heavy and fraught. Grimshaw weighed his options. Forcing the issue could turn ugly. There were other runaways, other tasks. These 3 weren't worth a bullet, or the paperwork. He made a sound of disgust. You'll regret this, Thorn. They'll bring you nothing but grief. When they run from you, or when Blackwood comes looking for what he thinks is his due for their keep, don't come crying to the laws. He wheeled his horse abruptly, kicking up another cloud of dust, and rode away, a dark figure shrinking against the vast horizon until he was once more just a speck, then nothing. Elias watched him go, his shoulders slowly relaxing, though the tension lingered in the air. He turned. Lily was looking at him, her eyes shining with unshed tears, but this time, it wasn't just sorrow in them. It was something else. Gratitude. And a burgeoning trust that felt as solid and real as the ground beneath his feet. He had stood as a guardian, and in doing so, had guarded a part of himself he thought long dead. The wind whispered not of threats now, but of possibilities. The dust began to settle. The dust Grimshaw had stirred settled slowly, coating the sparse grass and the weathered wood of the cabin in a fine, gritty layer. It felt symbolic, like the residue of a storm past. Sarah had stopped crying, her small face pressed against Lily's side, her tiny fists still clenched. Tom peeked out, his eyes wide and questioning. Lily simply looked at Elias, an ocean of unspoken emotion in her gaze. He didn't offer platitudes or false assurances. The world was still a harsh place. But for now, this small patch of it was safe. He walked over to the water barrel, dipped a ladle, and offered it to Lily. She drank, then gave it to Tom, then Sarah. The simple act of sharing water felt like a sacrament. He won't be back, Elias said, his voice rough but certain. Not for a while, anyway. He knew men like Grimshaw. Their bluster was their main weapon. Faced with true resolve, they often folded. The mention of Silas Blackwood, however, lingered like a bad taste. That was a different kind of threat, more personal, perhaps more persistent. But that was a worry for another day. Today, they had won a reprieve. Later, as the sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, a fragile peace settled over the cabin. Elias resumed his chores, the children trailing him, no longer huddled in fear but moving with a newfound, tentative confidence. Lily helped him mend a section of the corral fence, her small hand surprisingly strong as she handed him tools. Tom, with Sarah tagging along, chased grasshoppers in the tall grass near the creek, their occasional shouts of laughter startlingly sweet in the quiet air. It was a sound Elias hadn't realized he'd missed so profoundly, the uncomplicated joy of children. He found himself watching them, a small, almost imperceptible smile touching his lips. Martha would have liked this. She would have loved their spirit, their resilience. He imagined her humming a tune as she worked in her garden, these three small figures her willing assistants. The thought brought a pang, not of sharp grief this time, but of a gentle, wistful longing. He realized that protecting them hadn't just been about them. It had been about him, too. It was an affirmation of life, of connection, in the face of the vast emptiness that death had carved. Each nail he hammered into the fence felt like driving a stake into the heart of his own desolation. That evening, the stew tasted richer, the fire burned brighter. Lily, after putting her siblings to sleep on the bearskin, sat near the hearth, mending a tear in Tom's shirt with a needle and thread Elias had given her. Her movements were focused, her brow furrowed in concentration. She looked up and caught him watching. A faint blush rose on her cheeks. "Thank you, Mr. Thorne," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. For everything." Elias merely nodded. Words felt inadequate. He understood. In her eyes, he no longer saw just the reflection of his own sorrow. He saw a flicker of hope, a nascent trust that was both terrifying and precious. He saw the potential for a future he hadn't dared to imagine. The cabin, once a tomb of memories, was slowly, painstakingly, becoming a home again. Not the same home it had been with Martha, that was impossible. But something new, something alive. The wind outside still whispered, but its song had changed. It no longer spoke only of loss and solitude. Now, it carried the faint, fragile notes of a new beginning, a melody of shared breaths and tentative laughter, a promise of dawn after a long, dark night. The scars remained, on him, on them. But perhaps, together, they could learn to bear their weight, to find solace not in forgetting, but in the quiet strength of newfound belonging. The path ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, Elias Thorne didn't feel quite so alone walking it. He looked at the sleeping children, at Lily's bent head, and a profound sense of peace, edged with fierce protectiveness, settled over him. This was his purpose now. This was his stand. What binds us to one another? Is it blood, or the silent promises kept in the face of fear? If you've ever found an unexpected family in an unlikely place, let us know in the comments below. And if this story moved you, please subscribe for more tales of courage and connection. Click the next video to see what unfolds when hope takes root in the unlikeliest of hearts.